around Mario O'Shea's report or doing anything with it in this Dáil term. They're going to wait until the next election and leave it to the future government to deal with it. And the reason is clear, that they're sort of given in, or there's a veiled attempt to appease those anti-choice elements of both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who are very vocal and very strong, and many of them are senior members of Cabinet, and they're clearly coming out on top because the Minister, it looks like, is going to put an amendment to kick the legislation back a year. And of course, you kick it back a year, then it goes away from this government having to deal with it in reality. And so the role of the Green Party here is very important, because they have stated that they fully support the recommendations of the review, and therefore they would support the removal of the 3-day limit, the decriminalisation, the measures that are needed to deal with fatal anomaly, all of which, just to repeat, are contained in our bill, which will be read on Thursday. So I am appealing to the Green Party to really step up to the plate on this. They would have got a lot of votes and support from the repeal movement, and I'm also appealing to all deputies who supported the repeal campaign and who made it clear that they're for giving women full choice. And if we don't do this, what we are saying is we're condemning hundreds of women literally to wait till the next election, because we know from the figures, and again it's contained in the review, over 700 women and girls have had to travel out of this country since repeal to have their abortion services, and this is what we're going to condemn them to, and we're going to allow this government, as I say, in a thinly veiled way of appeasement to the most strongest voices that were anti-choice the last time round, now pushing their weight around again and saying we're not dealing with this. Kick for touch, don't deal with it, too sensitive. And that means that we're going to have to call on the movement around repeal to get active again, to put the pressure on government, but for those within this House that supported repeal and talked consistently about giving women a choice, they need to step up to the plate, and I'm particularly calling on the Green Party here to act on this and not allow the government away with it. Now, I have to go back down to the Climate Committee, so if there's any questions that you think of.
Do you think if it were to happen in November, though, if the review was acted on at that point, maybe that might allow something to happen before this Dáil finishes?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. You know this place better than I do, nearly, but the kicking for touch for a year would mean that we'd be coming up to next summer's recess and the potential for an election in the winter thereafter. So it is, basically it's saying we're not going to deal with it. They commissioned Mario O'Shea and the researchers to do a very, very fine report, and now basically they're going to ignore it, despite the fact that we will have 2 sessions on the Health Committee before the summer recess, but not acting on it is ignoring it, and the only reason for that is to appease those elements I spoke about.
Anyone else on the board? No.
Grant, thank you.
Okay, two issues. First of all, today we will be expressing our complete disbelief and outright opposition to the statements of the Taoiseach that he does not want €13 billion from Apple for the Apple tax allegations made by the EU Commission, and that instead he's hoping that Apple are going to win the case and that the people of this country won't get 13 billion. When you think about what 13 billion could do to help alleviate the impact of the cost of living crisis that is crushing hundreds of thousands of working families, the levels of deprivation we have in this country, the housing crisis that we are facing, the idea that the Taoiseach and the government do not want an additional 13 billion and in fact are going to spend millions on lawyers assisting Apple in not having to pay 13 billion euro is really quite shocking. You know, the sort of excuses for all this, that Apple didn't enjoy any kind of tax advantages, are simply belied by the facts. Apple were paying less than 1% on absolutely staggering revenues that were being generated by companies that were registered here, and were clearly involved in profit shifting in order to reduce their tax bill, facilitated by the Irish tax authorities, and that's absolutely clear when you look at the percentages of tax that are paid as against the absolutely staggering profits that were being made by Apple and by a small number of other IT companies. So really it's quite outrageous, and we will be expressing our determined opposition and outrage that the government doesn't want 13 billion and wants to back Apple, one of the richest companies in the world, as against standing up for the interests of the people of this country. Secondly, we will also, in the important debate that's taking place on accommodation for asylum seekers, be making two very, very, what we think are important points. First of all, that the government have set vulnerable asylum seekers up to be attacked and scapegoated by leaving them living in tents, homeless on the streets. They have put them in danger, and they have played into the hands of a far-right minority that wants to stir up hatred and poison and lies and scapegoat vulnerable asylum seekers for problems that are actually caused by government policy failure. Particularly their failure to deal with the housing crisis and to provide housing and accommodation to everybody who needs it in the country. But we will also be saying, really putting across what we think is an important point to make about the far right themselves. The far right are stirring up hatred and poison against asylum seekers and migrants in a very, very dangerous way. But in fact, what they're doing is doing the government a favour, because they're deflecting away from the campaigns for more public and affordable housing, for controlling rents and house prices, for addressing the housing crisis, and scapegoating immigrants and asylum seekers for that, when actually we should be directing the energy to deal with the real problems in Irish society at the failures of government policy. And really, we want to draw the public's attention to the fact that when you look at the agenda of the far right, it is an absolutely rotten agenda. Not only are they scapegoating asylum seekers, they have come out clearly and said they're against having the right to housing in the Constitution. They are against reinstating the eviction ban. In other words, they want to see people evicted. They don't want sex education in our schools, so they want to go back to a situation where the church controlled sex education in schools, and children were vulnerable to abuse of all sorts when sex education is actually something that protects children. So these so-called champions of the community are actually really doing the dirty work of the establishment, deflecting attention away from the government and backing up a very, very reactionary agenda on a whole range of policies.
What do you think would be a policing strategy to tackle those approaches?
Yeah, I think there's very serious questions when you just look at the contrast between the treatment of the Debenhams workers. The film is going on general release in the cinemas this week, and I would strongly advise people to go and see that film. But what you will be shocked at is the heavy-handed, brutal policing that was meted out to Debenhams workers all across the country when they were fighting a just case for proper redundancy. And then contrast that with the light touch policing that we've seen from the police against these really very sinister far-right elements. So you have to ask very serious questions about the consistency of policing standards.
In light of that, what do you make of the proposals going to Cabinet today that will see assaults on Gardaí and other emergency services have harsher penalties?
Well, obviously no frontline public service workers should be subject to violence. They need to be protected. But to be honest, the real problem we're facing is the failure of the government to deal with issues like the housing crisis, deprivation, the shocking neglect of many working class communities. None of that is the excuse for the poison of the far right, but we need to put resources and investment into addressing the housing crisis and addressing neglect and deprivation in many working class communities across this country if we really want to deal with the root of the problem.
So I want to deal with two issues. I want to deal with the issue of vacant office space being used for apartments. But first, as a deputy for Cork North Central, I want to make some comments about the Apple tax case. So I live in Blackpool. Blackpool is 2 miles away. from Apple's European headquarters in Hollyhill. If you drive up there and you stand on the hill that the campus is based on and look out over the city, you will see hospitals that make headlines every second week for record levels of overcrowding. You'll see schools whose doors are only kept open till the end of the year through the tireless fundraising efforts of staff and parents. These schools and hospitals are crying out for increased state investment, as are schools and hospitals right throughout the state. And yet the government are sending lawyers into court today to fight a case which, if successful, would mean more than 13 million for the state, paid for by the wealthiest corporation in the world, who paid tax, for example, in 2014 in this state at a rate of 0.05%. Right? Government's approach is galling and it's very wrong. And as a deputy who lives in that constituency, I want to register that point. On the question of office space, I would like to see families who are locked out of the housing market being able to live in apartments, and that would include apartments that are currently in vacant office space. However, I would issue a warning on this, right? There is no way that this idea should be turned into a bailout for failed property developers who gambled on office space, who lost the gamble, and who will see this as an opportunity now to make a quick killing. All right? There should be no fortunes made from this, from property developers who gambled and failed. It should be done for the needs of people who need the apartments rather than the profits of a tiny few. Okay?
If it solved the crisis, maybe if there was an easy way to quickly get out of apartments.
Well, as I've said, Micheál, I'm happy to see people who are locked out of the housing market, who aren't able to get their hands on an apartment for themselves or their family, being accommodated in what is currently a vacant office space. But I am warning against the idea that this could be a quick fix for profits for developers who can't get rid of vacant office space. I mean, some commentators would say that it should be cost price and basic cost price. Socialists would argue that it should be taken into public ownership with compensation paid, yes, but only on the basis of proven need. The key point I'm making here is it's not an opportunity for profiteering. This needs to be an opportunity for housing people. Although it should be said as well that this has been tried quite a bit in other jurisdictions in the United States and the UK, and it's had limited success. There are issues with it, but we're not opposed to it in principle.